The world is holding its breath over Taiwan, but here's what they're not telling you. While mainstream media feeds you the same tired narrative about inevitable conflict, the real story is far more complex and far more revealing about the dying world order. See, a China-Taiwan war isn't just about two nations or regional sovereignty. It's about the desperate death throes of a unipolar empire that's watching its financial hegemony crumble in real time. The United States doesn't actually care about Taiwan's democracy. This is about semiconductors, about maintaining dollar dominance, and about preventing the inevitable rise of a multipolar world. What nobody's discussing is how this manufactured crisis serves as the perfect distraction from collapsing Western economies, from the weaponization of the dollar that's backfiring spectacularly, and from the fact that the majority of the world is quietly building alternative systems outside Washington's control. The Taiwan situation is a pressure valve, one that the empire might just be forced to release because the cost of confrontation has become too catastrophic even for them. The question isn't if war will happen. The question is, can the old guard accept their diminishing power without dragging us all into the abyss? Let me be very direct with you about something that should be obvious, but somehow gets lost in all the noise and propaganda we're constantly bombarded with. The entire Taiwan narrative that's being pushed through every major media outlet, every think tank paper, every congressional hearing, is fundamentally dishonest. It's not dishonest because the facts are wrong, necessarily, but because the framing is deliberately misleading. When you hear politicians and pundits talk about defending Taiwan's democracy or standing up to Chinese aggression, what they're really talking about is something else entirely. And once you understand what that something else is, the whole picture starts to make a lot more sense. Think about it this way. The United States has military bases in over 70 countries around the world. We have troops stationed in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. We've been involved in regime change operations, both covert and overt, in dozens of nations over the past 70 years. We've bombed countries that never attacked us, imposed sanctions that have killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and destabilized entire regions in the name of democracy and freedom, and yet we're supposed to believe that our sudden concern over a small island off the coast of China is purely about protecting democratic values and international law. Does that really pass the smell test? Here's what's actually happening, and you won't hear this analysis on CNN or Fox News or read it in the New York Times. Taiwan sits at the absolute center of the global semiconductor industry. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, produces more than 90% of the world's most advanced chips. These aren't just any chips. These are the cutting-edge semiconductors that power everything from smartphones to artificial intelligence systems to advanced military hardware. Whoever controls access to these chips controls a massive lever of power in the 21st century economy. And right now that lever is sitting just 100 miles off the coast of mainland China, in a territory that Beijing has considered part of China since long before the Chinese Communist Party even existed. Now, the United States has spent the last several decades building an economic order based on a very simple principle: the dollar is king. Every major commodity, especially oil, gets traded in dollars. If you want to buy or sell on the international market, you need dollars. This creates constant demand for US currency, which allows the Federal Reserve to print money with relative impunity because that money gets absorbed by global trade. It's an extraordinary privilege, and it's allowed the United States to run massive deficits, fund endless wars, and maintain a standard of living that would be impossible if we actually had to balance our books like every other country. But this system, this dollar hegemony, is under serious threat right now, and Taiwan is right at the heart of why. China has been systematically building alternative financial infrastructure for years. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about building ports and railways. It's about creating trading networks that don't depend on Western financial institutions, that don't require dollars, and that don't give Washington veto power over economic activity. The digital yuan is another piece of this puzzle. So are the increasing number of bilateral trade agreements where countries agree to settle transactions in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. Russia and China trading in rubles and yuan. Saudi Arabia considering accepting yuan for oil. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a coordinated effort to create a multipolar financial system. And here's where Taiwan becomes absolutely critical to understanding the real stakes. If China were to take control of Taiwan, even peacefully through some kind of reunification agreement, Beijing would control the world's most advanced semiconductor production. That means they could potentially restrict access to these chips, or at least threaten to restrict access, which would give them enormous leverage over every advanced economy in the world. The United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, everyone depends on these chips. Our entire modern economy runs on them. Imagine if China could say to countries that want access to advanced semiconductors, you need to start trading with us in yuan, not dollars. Or you need to distance yourself from US military alliances, or any number of other conditions that would accelerate the decline of American hegemony. This is why you see such hysteria in Washington about Taiwan. It's not really about democracy. If it were about democracy, we wouldn't be such close allies with Saudi Arabia or Egypt or any number of authoritarian regimes that serve American interests. It's about maintaining control over the critical infrastructure of the global economy. It's about preventing China from acquiring a strategic asset that could be used to undermine the dollar system. And it's about preserving a unipolar world order where Washington gets to make the rules and everyone else has to follow them. But here's the thing that makes this whole situation so dangerous and so unstable. That unipolar order is already collapsing. You can see it everywhere if you're paying attention. The sanctions war against Russia was supposed to cripple their economy and force Putin out of power. Instead, Russia has strengthened its ties with China, India, and much of the global south. The ruble didn't collapse. The Russian economy didn't implode. In fact, Russia's pivot to the east has accelerated the very de-dollarization that Washington was trying to prevent. Every time the United States weaponizes the dollar, whether through sanctions or asset freezes or cutting countries off from the SWIFT payment system, it teaches the rest of the world a very clear lesson. Dependence on the dollar-based system is a strategic vulnerability. Countries are learning this lesson. They're watching what happened to Russia. They're watching what happened to Afghanistan when the US froze billions in Afghan assets. They're watching what happened to Venezuela, to Iran, to anyone who crosses Washington. And they're quietly, methodically building alternatives. Gold reserves are increasing. Bilateral currency agreements are proliferating. Alternative payment systems are being developed. The BRICS nations, which now include not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but also Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, are working on creating their own currency for international trade. This isn't speculation. This is actually happening right now. So when you understand that context, the Taiwan situation looks very different. It's not about whether China has the right to claim Taiwan or whether Taiwan has the right to independence. Those are legitimate questions, but they're not what's driving policy in Washington. What's driving policy is the recognition that American power is declining and that Taiwan represents one of the last major leverage points to slow down that decline. If the US can keep Taiwan out of Beijing's control, it maintains at least some check on China's ability to reshape the global economic order. If Taiwan falls into Beijing's orbit, whether through military action or political reconciliation, that's a massive strategic loss for Washington. Now here's where it gets really interesting and really dangerous. The United States is not in a strong position to actually fight a war with China over Taiwan. I know that sounds controversial given all the talk about American military superiority, but look at the facts. China has overwhelming geographic advantage. Taiwan is right off their coast. They can bring the full weight of their military to bear in that region. The United States, meanwhile, would be operating thousands of miles from home at the end of very long supply lines in a region where China has been building up anti-access, area denial capabilities for decades. Their hypersonic missiles, their submarine fleet, their integrated air defense systems, all of this is designed specifically to make it incredibly costly for the US military to operate in the Taiwan Strait. And it's not just about military capability, it's about will and stakes. For China, Taiwan is a core interest. It's tied up with national identity, with historical grievances going back to the century of humiliation, with the Communist Party's legitimacy. The Chinese government has made it absolutely clear that they will not accept permanent separation of Taiwan. For the United States, Taiwan is important, but is it important enough to risk a major war with a nuclear-armed power? Is it important enough to potentially lose aircraft carriers and thousands of American lives? Is it important enough to risk a conflict that could go nuclear? When you ask the question that way, the calculus starts to look very different. This is why I think the real story about Taiwan isn't about whether war will happen. It's about whether the declining hegemon, the United States, can accept its diminishing power gracefully or whether it will lash out in increasingly desperate and dangerous ways. And this is where we need to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, which is the role of the military-industrial complex and the national security establishment in perpetuating these conflicts. There are enormous financial interests that benefit from tension with China. Defense contractors make billions from the constant drumbeat of threat inflation. The Pentagon's budget keeps growing, now over $800 billion a year, and a huge chunk of that is justified by the China threat. Think tanks in Washington, many of them funded by defense contractors, produce an endless stream of papers about the need to counter Chinese aggression. Retired generals and admirals cycle through the revolving door, going from military service to defense company boards to cable news pundit slots, all while pushing for more military spending and more confrontation. This isn't a conspiracy, it's just how the system works. There are powerful constituencies that benefit from perpetual tension and the constant possibility of war. And then you have the ideological dimension, which is perhaps even more dangerous than the financial interests. There's a whole class of foreign policy thinkers in Washington who genuinely believe in American exceptionalism, who believe that the United States has a right and a responsibility to shape the world according to our values, who see any challenge to American primacy as not just a strategic threat, but a moral failing. These people are true believers. They are not corrupt in the traditional sense. They really think that the world where China has more influence and America has less is a darker, more dangerous world. They see any accommodation with Beijing as appeasement. They see any acceptance of multipolarity as surrender. But here's what they don't understand, or what they refuse to accept. The rest of the world is tired of American hegemony. They're tired of being told what to do, of having their governments overthrown when they don't comply, of being sanctioned and bombed and lectured about democracy by a country that often acts like an empire. The Global South, in particular, is increasingly aligning with China, not because they love the Chinese system, but because China offers them infrastructure, investment, and trade without the constant moralizing and interference that comes with Western engagement. China doesn't demand that countries adopt certain political systems or certain social policies. They just want to do business. This is a fundamental shift in global power dynamics, and it's happening whether Washington likes it or not. The question is how the United States responds. Do we accept that we're moving into a multipolar world and try to carve out a strong but not dominant position in that world? Do we work with other powers to create new international frameworks that reflect current realities rather than the power dynamics of 1945? Or do we double down on primacy, on containment, on trying to maintain a unipolar order that's already slipping away? Taiwan is the test case for that question, and right now it looks like Washington is choosing confrontation over accommodation. The weapons sales to Taiwan keep increasing. The diplomatic visits keep escalating. The military exercises in the region keep expanding. Every one of these actions is framed as defensive, as necessary to deter Chinese aggression. But from Beijing's perspective, and frankly from any objective strategic analysis, these look like provocations designed to prevent reunification and maintain American influence in the region. Here's what really worries me about all of this. Wars often happen not because anyone really wants them, but because of miscalculation, because of escalation spirals that get out of control, because leaders back themselves into corners where they feel they have no choice but to act. The First World War is the classic example. Nobody really wanted that war. It happened because of alliance commitments, mobilization schedules, and a series of decisions that seemed rational in the moment but led to catastrophe, and we're creating very similar conditions around Taiwan right now. China has made clear that certain actions would trigger a military response. If Taiwan declares formal independence, that's a red line. If foreign troops are permanently stationed on the island, that's a red line. If it looks like Taiwan is developing nuclear weapons, that's a red line. Now, the United States hasn't crossed those red lines, but we keep dancing right up to them. We keep testing the boundaries, we keep increasing the pressure, and at some point, either through intention or through accident, someone is going to cross a line that can't be walked back. And if that happens, if there actually is a war over Taiwan, the consequences would be absolutely devastating. We're not talking about another Middle East intervention where the US can bomb with impunity and face no real retaliation at home. We're talking about a conflict between two major powers, both with advanced militaries, both with nuclear weapons, both deeply integrated into the global economy. The economic disruption alone would be catastrophic. Supply chains would collapse, trade would freeze, financial markets would crater. And that's assuming the conflict stays conventional and doesn't escalate to nuclear exchange, which is a very big assumption when you're talking about two nuclear-armed states in an existential struggle. So what's the alternative? What should US policy toward Taiwan actually look like if we're being honest about our interests and realistic about our capabilities? I think we need to acknowledge some uncomfortable truths. First, Taiwan is never going to be a permanent, separate state that Beijing accepts. The Chinese government has made that absolutely clear, and they have the power to back up that position. Second, the United States cannot militarily prevent reunification if China is determined to achieve it. We might be able to make it very costly, but we cannot prevent it. And third, our real interest isn't in Taiwan's political status per se, but in ensuring that any resolution is peaceful and that it doesn't give Beijing the ability to use semiconductor production as a weapon against the rest of the world. If we acknowledge those realities, then the smart play is to work towards some kind of negotiated settlement that preserves Taiwan's autonomy in practice while allowing Beijing to claim reunification in principle, something like the one country, two systems model that was supposed to apply to Hong Kong, but actually implemented and enforced with international guarantees, combined with a massive effort to diversify semiconductor production so that the world isn't dependent on factories in Taiwan, which is actually already happening with chip fabrication plants being built in the United States and Europe and other locations. But that kind of pragmatic approach requires giving up on the fantasy of permanent American primacy. It requires accepting that China is going to be a major power with its own sphere of influence. It requires acknowledging that the unipolar moment is over and that we need to learn how to operate in a multipolar world. And that's a very hard pill for Washington to swallow, especially for a foreign policy establishment that's been raised on the idea of American exceptionalism and indispensability. The tragedy is that the longer we wait to make this adjustment, the more dangerous the situation becomes and the less leverage we have. Right now, there might still be space for negotiation, for creative diplomacy, for finding solutions that give everyone enough of what they want to avoid catastrophe, but that space is closing. Every escalation makes compromise harder. Every weapons sale, every military exercise, every congressional delegation visiting Taipei reinforces the narrative on both sides that this is an existential struggle that can only be won, not negotiated. And if we let that narrative take hold completely, if we convince ourselves that there's no alternative to confrontation, then we're sleepwalking into a disaster that will make the Iraq War look like a minor foreign policy mistake. This is why understanding what's really at stake in Taiwan matters so much. It's not about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's not about international law or self-determination. It's about the transition from one world order to another, about whether that transition happens peacefully or violently, and about whether the United States can adapt to a world where we're still powerful but no longer dominant. Those are the real questions, and they're questions that will determine not just the fate of Taiwan, but the shape of the entire 21st century. And right now, we're getting the answers to those questions very, very wrong.